All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leo Lane. I sit on the Law Society of Yukon's Continuing Professional Development Committee, and today I have the privilege of introducing to you Christina Lang, manager of the Integrated Restorative Justice Unit in the Yukon Department of Justice. She's here today to tell us about the theory and functions of a new restorative justice and diversion initiative based in Whitehorse. Christina has been working in the field of Indigenous restorative justice since 2009. She started as a victim offender mediator in Regina and then moved north to run the Alternative Measures Extrajudicial Sanctions Program for the Meadow Lake Tribal Council, servicing 9 First Nations communities. And while there, she facilitated sentencing circles, reintegration circles, and trained new mediators in victim offender reconciliation. She then did a stint with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Justice in the Dispute Resolution Office, and in 2017 moved here to Whitehorse, spent a couple of years working for YG in crime prevention and community policing, then did a temporary assignment with the Kwanlin Dun First Nation, managing their new restorative justice and community safety initiatives. And now she is leading the Yukon government's new Integrated Restorative Justice Unit, which she's here to tell us about today. Just a couple of comments about the format before I hand things over to Christina. All of the attendees are muted for the presentation, but we do want to encourage audience participation. So if you have a question at any point, you can type it into the chat window. You don't have to save it for the end. You can ask as we go. And I'm going to be monitoring the chat, and I'll step in and read the question aloud for Christina as we go. Now, when I get to your question, I will give you the option through the app to unmute your mic in case you have any follow-up questions or comments. And whether you speak or not is totally up to you. You'll see the prompt pop up, and if you're content to just rely on the text question that you submitted and await the answer, that's fine. Just ignore the prompt and we'll move on. But if you want to chime in and speak to Christina, then you can do that too. And as well, we have time set aside after the presentation for a Q&A. And just to let you know, the presentation and Christina's PowerPoint will be posted on our website, the Law Society's website. You just go to the main menu. There's a link called For the Lawyer and then CPD events, and there you'll find notices about upcoming events as well as videos and materials from our past recorded events. So thanks very much for attending on this somewhat sunny afternoon, and please join me in welcoming Christina Lang. Christina.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you for the great introduction. And yeah, hello to everyone. Thank you for joining today. As Leo said, I'm fairly informal with my presentation style, so I'm open to questions as they come up. But of course, if you want, you can leave them till the end afterwards. But yeah, I'm fairly interactive. So if that's on your brainwave, then feel free to shout out the question and I will try to answer it. So yeah, so today this is a presentation by the Yukon Government Integrated Restorative Justice Unit. And as Leo said, I am leading this unit, and we are currently on a 2-year pilot project. And we are looking to seek permanency, and so those are some of the pieces we're pulling together while we're on this pilot project. So what today is going to be about is we're going to start and talk just a bit about some of the theories behind restorative justice processes, victim offender mediation, those type of diversion pieces that you may be referring clients to. And then we're going to touch a little bit on best practices across Canada, and then really talk about what we're doing here in the Yukon with the Integrated Restorative Justice Unit and some of the innovations that we're coming up with and working towards. Right now, it's across Canada, well, in fact, across the world, but in Canada, the climate's ready for restorative justice. And for me, that's really exciting. As Leo said, I've been working in restorative justice for years, and at a time that it wasn't necessarily a priority or mandate. And So it's really exciting that we're here and we can look at restorative justice for justice transformation, and Canada is ready, and we've got the political backing, and yeah, so really exciting time to be in this world. So I'm quite happy to be here. Okay. So what is restorative justice? Restorative justice refers to an approach to justice that seeks to repair harm by providing opportunity for those harmed and those who take responsibility for the harm to communicate and address their needs in the aftermath of a crime. So this is one particular definition. This comes off of the national website, what they say restorative justice is. But the idea of restorative justice, it's more than a definition. It's more than an action. It's a philosophy. It's a way of being. It's an ethos, if you will. So for individual programs, and you might see this across Canada or anywhere, there's going to be different definitions of how they are choosing to define restorative justice. Some of them might have more of cultural implications, whereas other of them might be more really just about, allowing those who have been impacted by the harm that's been done to have a say in what's in really how they're going to repair that harm. And that's really the crux of it is we need to involve those who have been part of it to decide what's going to happen. And that includes the wrongdoer or the offender, which we often call them, to then also say what they want to do to give back to the community and repair that piece. So rather than just, rather than just one person deciding how they're going to make it right, it's more of a collective agreement on what we can do as a community as a whole to really repair those harms. So it is based on the principles of reconciliation, reparation, respect, and reintegration. And when we look at here, this beautiful triangle here, we've got the victim on the one side, we've got the offender on the other side, and then we've got this community piece, right? And restorative justice is somewhere in the middle. So it's not up to one person or the other. It is more of that collective on how we're going to move on from here and how we're really going to come together as a community to help even support that wrongdoer. I'll give you an example. I was working with an elder who had sat down to do a circle with a youth, and this particular youth had done some damage to some fences in the community, in the small community. And, everyone sat in this circle and they said, Tommy, shouldn't have been doing that. He's out late. He needs to repair the fence. He needs to, give back. He needs to be more respectful. And everyone had these ideas. And it wasn't until one person stood up and they said, yes, and right, where were we all when Tommy was outside and no one was feeding him supper? Where were we, when we knew he was struggling in school, right? Where were we when he started to get into that bad crowd, right? So it's more than just the idea that one person is necessarily, wholly responsible, although they do have to take responsibility in restorative processes. But it's this idea that as a community, we can come together and rectify a situation. And with the idea that then that is going to really impact and be meaningful to everyone so that they're less likely to reoffend in the future, as well as the community has participated, you get that buy-in factor. So restorative justice theory. So here we have the community, the victim, the offender, and then you can see on this triangle, we have community safety, we've got competency development, and we've got accountability. And in that other little triangle there, we have the concept of restorative justice. So this is what I'm talking about when it involves everyone. There is a community safety element to it that needs to be addressed. Accountability has to happen on the side of offender, and maybe in certain circumstances, like I was saying, maybe the accountability piece also has to come from the community or families or whatever that looks like. Every situation's really, it's going to be really different. So that's where that community piece is, and that competency development, this idea that out of any type of restorative justice process or practice, and it doesn't really matter which type of process or practice that we're speaking of, but there's got to be a learning opportunity, and there's got to be some sort of future development for where this person is going to grow and learn and move from. But the idea is, for true restorative justice processes to occur, all of these people or all these elements have to be involved at some point. So I want to talk just about the satisfaction triangle. And I'm not sure if anyone's heard this before, but this is the theory that we use often when we do any type of victim offender mediation or community justice forum. So this is a theory by Christopher Moore, and he's the author of The Mediation Process. And he distinguishes 3 types of interests. So we have, you have on the one side your procedural, and then on the other side, you have your psychological and relationship, and you have your substantive. So typically, if you see a conflict, people they really dig into their positions and focus on the substantive. And that means, what is it that I want out of this? What am I going to get, right? And that's fine. And that's people's go-to, because if we don't always look at the problem as a whole, if we don't properly assess to see what is the actual problem to then figure out alternative solutions, it is easiest just to focus on the substantive. But what they've found, and what Christopher Moore has found, is that the conflict won't go away. Reparations, true reparations or meaningful reparations, won't happen unless all of these interests align. So that includes the procedural and the psychological. So the procedural would be some sort of process side, right? And now, whether it was a process and it was in the event of a crime or something, has happened that way, or maybe the process or procedure of how they're dealing with it. It's very important to address that. Same with the psychological or the relationship side. If that is left unsatisfied, often people will not be truly happy with the substantive outcome. And I think we see this sometimes in cases, something goes to court and people, if they hadn't had their say, or they want justice, but they don't know what that means, they haven't had time to unpack it, that they might get what they think they want, right? And what they've said all along they want, because they focus on the substantive. But if we haven't addressed these other issues, then at the end, you'll find that victims will feel deflated, or they're like, it wasn't enough. I'll give you an example of how this might play. I was doing a civil mediation, and it was with a high-powered CEO of or HR CEO of a crown corporation, a large crown corporation, and she was filing a dispute for wrongful dismissal. So this woman was 2 years away from her retirement, and she had gone up to her office like she usually did, and then all of a sudden, the other CEO, because there was 3 or 4 of them, I believe, came over and said, unfortunately, we've gone another direction. You're not going to be working here. You need to get all your stuff out, by 10 o'clock today. And we're going to give you this great severance package, right? So then, of course, she brought this forth as a civil dispute. So when we were doing this mediation, we were really focused on the substantive, right? Like, how much money can this woman get? She's 2 years from her retirement. So they thought they actually said they were going to give her a 20-month salary, and that her salary was very, very high, very lucrative. And it wasn't enough. So she was digging for more, and she was asking her lawyer. She said, we need to go for more. We need to go above what the typical precedence for that province is, and we need to go for more. And so they're trying and doing this kind of back and forth and figuring out how much can the Crown Corporation pay and how much is going to satisfy her. And it turned out it wasn't about the money entirely. I'm not saying it's not, because there's always that substantive piece. But what had been left unaddressed was the procedural and the psychological relationships. So she had been working in that Crown Corporation since she was out of university, and she had she had never worked anywhere else. So she had loyalty to that organization. And, you know, the impact of the relationship between most of her work friends that she had, you know, grown with and been part of this organization for, to just be severed, that was an issue. And then along with the procedural issue in this case was how she was let go. So she realized later, once they started to go through a civil dispute, they realized later that that she had actually met her replacement in the elevator probably a week before. So they had already hired and they had done that behind her back. And in their minds, they were just saying, we're just changing the focus, right? We need to bring in someone younger, different experiences, right? And this is just going to be a simple, you know, change of action. But for her, that procedural piece and that psychological and relationship piece weren't addressed in the way that they had done this. So what we actually ended up doing is having a conversation with the HR management and then the other CEOs of the company to discuss those pieces. And out of that came an apology and also an admittal that the way that they went about it was maybe not the best way. So all of that came out. They had a discussion around that. And then we were able to land on the substantive amount, which was considerably lower than what they were initially asking for. And that's because all of the pieces of the satisfaction triangle were addressed. So we use this often, even if I'm doing a mediation with folks and you need to get them to see something, you need to get them unstuck from their positions. Sometimes we'll just draw this and ask them, like, what are your substantive, what's the procedural, what's the relationship piece? You know, sometimes people don't want to talk about relationship when they're thinking about, you know, a civil suit, for example, or if they're a victim of something, because we think that that deals with emotions. And so, you know, we can say, well, what's the impact, right? Like, because there's always going to be that other psychological impact that is not going to be necessarily addressed through substantive, but sometimes through, you know, proper conversation and meaningful conversation, I should say. And that's when you can address those pieces, and then you're able to focus on the substantive. So this is the conflict iceberg theory. And this talks about, so you can see you've got two icebergs that are above the seawater, right? So let's say that's the green part. That's the part that's poking out. That's what they say are your positions. Those are the fixed solutions. Those are the demands. Underneath the water, what we can't see are the interests. And your interests are your underlying fears, needs, concerns, wants, hopes, those pieces that we don't often talk about, and we might not even know that we have, you know, these underlying interests. So you have to kind of get to those interests when people make these statements, right? I'm sure many of you have heard, you know, if you're talking to a victim and they say, you know, I want justice, right? I want that person to pay. I want them to go to jail. That's something that I think we've all heard often. So that would be their fixed, that would be their position. That's what they're saying, and their fixed solution. So they already have a solution and that they've identified. But if you look down to this lighter green area that says common interest, that is where the two icebergs intersect, right? So this is where you're going to be able to get your zone of possible agreement, or they call it the ZOPA, right? That's when you're going to be able to come to some sort of agreement once you get to find those common interests, that common understanding, and that's where you're going to be able to make the magic happen. There's going to be more wiggle room. If everyone stays on their positions and fixed solutions, they're not likely to come to any kind of agreement, because they haven't heard each other out. And more than that, yeah, you're not able to necessarily find creative solutions when you've already decided what the solution is. And that's one of the pieces, or one of the theories for restorative justice, is that we always want to look at what appears to be the problem, what's being presented to us, and if there's other things underlying in their interests. So for example, for a victim, they might be saying these things, right? I want someone to go to jail. I want them to pay. And then when you get down to their underlying interest, it could be fear, right? They could be fearful and they want some sort of assurance of safety, and they want to have a conversation. Maybe they even want to face the person and have that conversation. Maybe it's more about they feel they've been targeted, so they want to know why. And sometimes just hearing from someone who says, you know what, it was just easy. That's why I, broke into your house, because it was unlocked. It was nothing personal. That simple statement and that understanding of where someone else comes from might be able to move them in that security sense, right? So once again, not talking about the substantive, because something will still have to come out of that for them to pay reparations, but helping both individuals or maybe a community move on from a crime or harm or wrongdoing, is this idea of understanding even where the other person's coming from. And I say that piece about understanding doesn't mean you excuse it, right? So we'll often hear, through restorative processes, if you're dealing with a person who's caused the harm, we'll often hear, a story, maybe it had to do about their upbringing and it was difficult. And that doesn't mean we excuse it away, but understanding some of their background, maybe what led them, maybe some of their interest, fears, needs, hopes, right, can at least give that other person a bit of assurance of safety that allows them to then maybe focus on a different type of agreement, something out of the realm, because they hadn't thought about it before as the problem. So it's all about figuring out what the actual problem is before we jump to solutions. I'll give you an example of Christopher Moore's theory on problem solving and how we need to look at problems and solutions and in order to do a restorative process. So in this example, there is a woman and she's driving her car, and sure enough, her kid's in the back seat and he's playing with these marbles in the back of the car. And, she stops short at a red light, and these marbles all come tumbling out and they're all over the car. So then she keeps driving, she yells at her son to, get his marbles back together and shouldn't be playing with them in the car, and drops him off at daycare. Keeps driving and she hears the sound. It's like every time she goes forward, and then goes every time that it moves back. So now this is driving her insane, right? So she's like, I got to fix this. I have to fix this problem, right? There is a marble that somehow has rolled back from the back seat and it's rolled into the trunk, and now it's rolling around every time that I'm moving. So she goes to an auto body and she says, what can we do? And so they're looking at it and they're saying, let's tear apart the trunk. And so, they cost out how much that will cost her, and how much time it's going to be. And that's the solution. And I think for most of us, when we think about that, that is the most evident solution. But the restorative justice theory would say, okay, let's look at this again with fresh eyes and really figure out what is the actual problem with this marble. Is it the idea that the marble is rolling around in the trunk? Not really, because it's not going to impact how the car drives, right? It's not going to wreck the car any more than it already is. So what's the actual problem here? So if you sit and work that out, you'd say, well, it's actually the noise. The noise is driving her a bit batty, right? So that's what we need to rectify. It's not about always taking the marble out. It's about figuring out how to stop the noise. So once they looked at a solution from a different perspective, then they were able to say, you know what, I see the hole where it comes in. They put some little bit of glue in there. Sure enough, the next time she drove, and that marble went in the back of the trunk, and then it's stuck there. Done. Easy solution, right? So that's what this speaks about when we talk about restorative justice theory. Is we can't jump to the solutions. We can't look at these positions and then come to a solution with there. We need to dig deeper. We need to figure out what the underlying problems are, and then maybe how to solve those problems. And then we can get to the substantive. So that's part of that satisfaction triangle theory, is that we need to address all needs, not just the one that's necessarily in front of us to create meaningful and effective change through restorative processes. So restorative justice interventions across Canada. There are many restorative justice interventions. There are many interventions that are partially restorative. There are many fully and mostly, and then partially restorative, and then totally restorative. And this is really, so there's this beautiful diagram that you see before you, and it's not set in stone. You could argue one is more restorative than the other, and that's fine. This is just to give you an idea across Canada of what what they're saying is more restorative versus not. So for example, there are across the provinces and territories, everyone has a diversion type program, which we have now as well. And some of those diversions are restorative and some of them may not be. They might just be simply that, a diversion from the court, or diverted from something. And for Yukon government, for what we're doing is all of our diversions will be through a restorative justice lens. Now, that's not to say that something might come to us and we might not, maybe there isn't a clear victim, maybe the community hasn't been harmed, can we still work with them? Absolutely. Will it end up being more of that partially restorative? Perhaps, right? But with the work that we're doing in the Yukon is we are aiming to make all of our diversions restorative, at least from the smallest amount to at least, and the best case scenario is when we have full participation and are able to have a fully restorative process. But in lots of other provinces and territories, although there is a shift to that now and making all the diversions restorative, there are some that are straight. You come out and maybe it's from court. Right, it's been diverted from court, and then someone says, they go to counseling and they go to anger management and they do 5 hours of community service, right? So that's fine. That would be more in the partially restorative, you might be able to say, because there is a restorative element to it with having someone give back to the community. The pieces that's missing is that we haven't, like we talked about in the first slide, is we haven't pulled together all those who have been impacted by the crime to have a say in how it should be dealt with, right? So it's been one person, maybe it's the diversion program that's saying that this is what happened. Maybe, it really depends on the situation, but it's not going to be fully restorative unless we have all those players involved. So you can see here in the white part, it talks about the peace circles, which up here we talk about the peacemaking circles, or we might call them community justice forums. We have family group conferencing, so that's bringing everyone together to come up with some sort of agreement, and community conferencing. So these are the full restorative processes where you're going to have victim, offender, maybe you have someone from the community, maybe you've involved the arresting officer, right? There could be a host of people depending on the type of transgression or the type of crime that's occurred as to who you might invite. But when you're bringing all those people in, the goal of that then is for all those people, but particularly victim and offender, to come up with a mutually agreeable solution or agreement of what can be done to repair that harm. And with those people who are in that circle and who are invited to share, their concerns, they're invited to talk about how this has impacted them. They're invited to talk about those underlying interests, right, to really get to the crux of the issue. That's when you're going to get that buy-in, and there's going to be more of that fully restorative process that happens. Because two, it's not only for, so in restorative processes, whether it's one coming, through a criminal charge, or maybe if it's one coming from a school, kind of like a preventative one, we get what we call community referrals. It could be a healing circle, could be a reintegration circle. Doesn't matter which type it is, but the idea is that that offender or that wrongdoer, and sometimes there might be multiple, but they have to take responsibility for their actions. So they're given that opportunity to take responsibility, and then everyone else is given an opportunity to share how this has impacted them. And then at that point, they come up with that agreement. So what this does as far as that buy-in piece is that they've come up with the idea themselves, right? So so they already feel it like it's something that they want to do. But what it also does, especially when you're including people from the communities that are there to maybe share how they've been impacted, but when they get to hear this and when they get to be part of that agreement, they're also providing a social structure. So if you think about in like a Yukon First Nation community, if we have one of these community justice forums or community conferencing circles, let's say for a youth that let's say they stole a vehicle, right? So we're having this circle, we're talking about how this impacts the community. Maybe you've got someone from leadership and they are talking about how this is dangerous on the roads and this has made all these people scared, and they're having this conversation. When they come to the agreement, though, because they've been involved at the beginning, they're also there to support that person. So they can be there to help them. It's this idea of that integrated shaming, which is a word or it's a theory that we talk about in restorative justice. Typically in our Western worlds, we look at shaming as a bad thing, that it's not good, but they don't mean shaming in that way. When they talk about that reintegrated shaming, they're talking about the concept of somebody's admitted they're wrong. We've all talked about it. It's out in the open. And now they're welcoming you back to the community and they've been part of this. So then they become an actual structure of support to help you. And then of course, the idea being that this will lower recidivism rates and will act as a positive, or create a positive outcome for the offender and or the victims or those that are involved, because they see it from that person's perspective, they share in it, and then they support that person and try and build them up because they know their story. And part of it is about the ability to tell our story from all perspectives. So some of the other ones that we'll look at, communities of care, reconciliation, offender family services, family-centered social work. That can be, partially restorative because there's restorative pieces to it. You look at victim reparations, so victim services. It could be considered partially restorative, type of compensation. That could be considered partially restorative. I would put that more in if it was an agreement that was between the victim and the offender and they came up with the idea of compensation. I would say that's much more in the fully restorative piece. But if they're told that they have to compensate someone, it's going to be a little bit less. It'll give back maybe to the victim, but it should be something that they come up with together. Well, we just find that there's a higher success rate when all parties involved have come up to an agreement. Restitution, same thing, victim offender mediation. So in this one, they have that in the mostly restorative. Personally, I would put that more in the full restorative. But the reason that they've done that is because there's not the community involvement, right? But I think that's depending on the offense or situation. If there's not an offense, that sometimes it is just between the two people. And for us, sort of privacy concerns, and we don't need to involve people if they don't need to be involved, as much as we want to, encourage community participation in those. If it's something between, family, that's more of a private matter, we're not going to involve other people. Or if it's a pretty clear cut, there's one victim, there's one offender, then that's what we're going to do in our restorative process. We may involve an elder if they're looking for a spiritual component. We may involve, like I said, a community leader, or we have options for different elders. So, in the past, sometimes we've brought in, imams if somebody is looking to a spiritual leader, right? It could be Indigenous elder, it could be an imam, it could be a priest. It really doesn't matter, as long as it's somebody that they both agree to, who can offer kind of that extra spiritual guidance, but also that person that is going to be the keeper of peace in the group. So for some people, that's something that they're looking for, but other people not. So for us, with the Yukon Restorative Justice Program, we do not put anything on anyone else that they have to have, an elder come and they may not believe in that Indigenous spirituality, or that they have to have someone else. We really work with both victim and offender or community, depending on the circumstances, to figure out what's going to benefit this process the most and who needs to be there, right? So those are questions that we figure out. But I know in some other diversion programs, they might have staples, right, where like an elder attends every single one, and that's really up to the community that's running that program. So here in the territory, once all of the First Nation communities or other service providers who want to be partaking in this work, once we've kind of figured out their program plans and how it's going to work, that will be up to them, right? So there's going to be certain pieces that they have to adhere to, and those are mostly pieces that are in the criminal code, right? Some of the legislation in the criminal code, best practices across Canada are pieces they'll have to agree to. But as far as the type of processes they use, it's up to the individual communities or service providers to figure out what will work best, in their specific communities. And that's really so that it relates to, their particular culture and, anything about their community that makes them unique, or something they want because they know their citizens, right? And that's why across Canada, you'll see the different restorative justice or diversion programs, and they all look very different. They all have, some of those key similar pieces, but as far as the cultural piece, or even some of the process related pieces, they can look very different because they're meant to suit, those citizens and to really fit their needs. So then you also see here their offender responsibility. There's the idea of victim awareness programs, related community service. So sometimes if something happens, say, for example, someone was starting fires, then they might have to do something around fire safety, and they might have to take a program, right? So that could be something that's partially restorative. And your reparative boards, right? Sometimes some of you have maybe seen, maybe you've even participated in a type of accountability hearing through a restorative process, or a type of board who maybe like the Whitehorse Youth Justice Panel, right? And they are coming up with, some sanctions or interventions together, and then doling those out. So that would be in that partially restorative, because it doesn't necessarily include all those that were impacted, although it is meant to take, their wishes and their needs, right? But there is something about sitting together in a restorative process, and how you can see people are mobilized by and through those conversations. Okay. So restorative justice. Victims, offenders, and the support people develop their own mutually satisfying solution. So that's the agreement. We're usually coming towards some sort of an agreement that will help to repair the harm. And the offender is accountable by taking responsibility for actions and working to repair that harm. So crime has both individual and social dimensions of responsibility. It is believed that punishment alone is not effective in changing behavior, and that it's disruptive to the community harmony and good relationships. So restorative justice, the idea is that rather than just a punishment that would act as maybe a specific deterrence, maybe even a general deterrence, it's saying that, that's good, but this is going that extra step where, it's not the only thing that's effective in changing that one person's behavior. So it's about having those good relationships, right? So they'll say that, especially in, the certain Indigenous spiritualities, and not to lump them all into one because they're all very different, but there's this idea of relationships being that key piece, holding people together. And if someone doesn't have a relationship, or they're torn away from that relationship, then they're going down the wrong path, right? And so how do we get people back together, it's good relationships, right? So back to that first story about Tommy, who, but that's not a real name, by the way, but who was like who was painting on the fences, and they had that circle around, and they said, well, who has helped Tommy along the way, right? You can see that this was a young person who hasn't had relationships. So that's part of the reason, and that's part of also what we need to rectify. If we think to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you guys are familiar with that, it talks about kind of the different levels of what you need to get to the top of the triangle. It's another triangle. But the top is that idea of self-actualization. And to get there, you need all these other things underneath. And the first thing being like a safe home, right? You need safe home, you need shelter, you need food and water. So, restorative justice says, okay, someone's done wrong in here, and we're going to work to repair that harm. But also, what are the other factors that are underlying, right? What are some of those other interests for them? Maybe it is that they have, no food. Maybe it is that they don't have a safe place, right? So these are the pieces that we want to make sure that we're working with as well, and not just focusing on looking at one person as their one offense that they've done. So, and it's the same thing too, if we look at, I know they've done a lot of tests with animals to say, there's that one that I was reading about in Portugal recently, when they went from changing how they're viewing, the war on drugs, and then they said, well, let's legalize and use some of that money and put that towards, social programming and getting people into rehab and then getting them jobs, right? Because they based it on rats, and they were looking at rats who, if they were kept away from the rest of their rat family, then they started taking more of the LSD drug, right? They're the little sippy cups, versus the ones that had family and supports around them. Yes, they dabble every now and then, but then they were drinking more of the water. So they're likening that to humans, who we need relationships, we need people and supports in order to thrive. And the more that we get separated, and often offenders will separate themselves through their actions, right? But the more and more they get separated, then the less likely they are going to be able to come back in that safe structure piece. So part of the restorative justice philosophy is that we're addressing those other needs as well. So the offender is defined by capacity to make reparations. And of course, victims are central to the process of resolving crimes. And so for us right now, victim involvement is so key for restorative processes. Now, if they can't come or they choose not to participate, we will find alternatives, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it's really to make those reparations, we want that person there. We want their voice heard, and for them to be a part of it. Okay. Also, restorative justice focuses on the problem solving, liabilities, obligations, and the future. What can be done to move forward? Let's not just look at the past of what has been done. Yes, we need to address it, but we can't live in that spiral, right? Of seeing, if you're the offender, seeing yourself as the one thing you've done wrong, or the many things you've done wrong, right? We need to figure out how to move on. And sometimes, it's very hard conversations, because sometimes some of these people, it's not that they just get to go through a restorative process and then, they don't have a punishment to go with it. We can do restorative processes anywhere, on that continuum of the criminal justice system. So, we might do one for a very serious crime, and that person's still going to face jail. And that's part of their punishment, and that needs to happen for public safety, for a plethora of reasons, right? So, and it's not one or the other. Sometimes it's working them together. And so maybe they do have a punishment where they have to go to jail, but then we're looking at how to make other reparations to be able to move forward from that. The emphasis on dialogue and negotiation when we come together in a restorative process. There's a lot of talking, and sometimes it's not done in just one circle. I know there is there's thoughts where people say, like, it's easier to go through a restorative process than it is to go through court. It's one of the stereotypes I think that's out there, and all they do is talk some feelings, and then it's done. It's a slap on the wrist, right? And it's not. There is a lot of dialogue, and there does have to be a lot of accountability that person's taking, and it could go for a very long time. And in fact, the studies have shown that in Canada, that typically if people are coming to their restorative process and they're coming in good faith, and by that I mean that, they're coming to take accountability and everyone's coming to participate, that they'll end up with likely more on their agreement or more sanctions or whatever than would have happened in court. Now, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about the lower level offenses, but often people will put more on themselves of what they need to do to repair the harm than maybe somebody else would put on them. Restitution as a means of restoring both parties, the goal of reconciliation and restoration, right? So restitution going to a victim is great, but it can also be really, really beneficial for the person paying the restitution. They get a better idea of how much time it costs, or the value of, maybe the property that they damaged for that person. And so it's really helpful to have them move on, learn through that process, and then of course, they're less likely to reoffend. Community as facilitator of restorative processes, right? So this is back to that idea of involving the community as a whole. Response focused on harmful consequences of the offender's behavior, right? But then emphasis is on the future. So have to talk about what you've done, and then where are we moving forward from that? Direct involvement by participants and directly affected by the crime or conflict. So it's including those that have been impacted to have a say in how things will be moving on. So those are some of the, I would say, the key theories of and restorative justice. And by no means is this all, but these are some of the ones that would govern maybe some of the processes that if you've ever sat in one, or if you will sit in one, this is what it could look like. And these are some of the theories behind the approaches to restorative justice. As I said, they can all look a little bit different, and as they should, because they need to fit, the individual community, citizen, jurisdiction, however you want to look at that. So they will be different with some of the same, the same framework, if you will, for what best practices have to be done. So now I want to go, first of all, I'll just stop there and ask if we have any questions or comments on the theory side before we get into an overview of the new unit. Okay, so silence, I believe, means to go on. So Integrated Restorative Justice Unit. This unit started in January of last year, and what we did is we pulled two resources from the adult side of justice, from community corrections, who were doing some restorative pieces and who were working with the First Nation communities on the transfer payment agreements for the Indigenous court workers and for the community justice workers. So we pulled two of those resources. And then we pulled two of the youth justice resources from Health and Social Services and combined them into the unit that we have now. So that was the initial one, is that we had those 4 people, and then two on the adults, 2 on the youth side, as well as then myself, and then an admin. And this unit, the goal of the unit was really to increase the use of restorative processes across the territory. There was a federal, provincial, territorial commitment at the deputy minister level a couple of years back, where all the provinces and territories agreed to increase the use of restorative processes by 5%. And well, I'm just gonna see there's something in the chat there. Oh, perfect. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, sorry. What was I saying? Oh yeah. So anyway, so then we all agreed to really increase restorative processes by 5%. This is also as a response to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation report. With both of them speak to the use of restorative processes. And so this was the goal, to bring that together, but to also have the adult and youth restorative processes together on this ageless continuum. So there wasn't just this idea that, you know, the youth had to go to one department, adults had to go to another. And so most of you will know as well that there has been, you know, youth diversion that's been operational since the early 2003, I think, with the Whitehorse Youth Justice Panel and the community conferencing, but there hasn't really been an adult diversion or restorative program. So this was part of that as well, that we wanted, there was a gap in the services, and we wanted to fill that gap and have a really strong, robust and restorative justice program. So right now, the programs that we offer, as we are a pilot project, we're getting up and running, we do the Indigenous Court Worker Program. So we have 12 court workers out in the communities, and many of you will have met them, and they are working to assist, you know, clients navigating the justice system, breaking down barriers, helping them where they can. They don't give legal advice, but they will align them with the appropriate services. And so there's 12 of them. We also oversee the community justice program. So there we have 8 community justice workers in the First Nation communities. And they're the ones who are doing a lot of the community-led, community-designed restorative or crime prevention projects. So we fund that, and we work closely with them on training and development. And the majority of those community justice workers are taking on some of these files, and or in the future will be doing some of the restorative files, and particularly the diversions. So we will be doing some training on that as well, but we're also looking to expand, because like we said, right now there's only 8 in the First Nation communities, and then we have, like I said, the 2 youth resources and 2 adult resources here who can help, and we'll go out to the communities that maybe don't have a program, or if their program's not authorized yet, and we'll get to that slide in a moment. And then we have the Whitehorse Youth Justice Panel under our unit, and then the newest part of our unit is the Yukon Restorative Justice and Diversion Program. And we've called it this because it is diversion, and we are certainly, especially in that first year, focusing on pre and post charge diversions, and we are using restorative processes for them. Now, that's one piece of kind of the larger pie that we're going to be looking at. We are also looking to do reintegration circles. And so we've just hired a new staff, a Yukon First Nation person who's going to be coming. They start next Monday, which is very exciting. And they're going to be doing a lot of the reintegration work. So one of the pieces that when we're working with the First Nation communities, the gaps that they have identified is when people are in the correctional facility and then they come out, if they haven't signed on to the victim notification, then they're not going to be notified when someone's coming out in the community unless someone's gotten permission somewhere else, right? So what happened, and this by no fault of, you know, any of the other departments, but this person will be released and they'll be going out to a community, and that could be triggering for that community. So one of the pieces that we're working on is to do these reintegration circles as through a restorative process. And I think already we're seeing an uptick on people that want to participate in that. And similarly to the pre or post charge, it's all voluntary. So, you know, the client who's in the correctional center has to want to do it, as well as the community. But with the community, we can really work with the justice workers, we can work with chief and council, and then pull together, you know, this reintegration circle. And so that goes back to what I was talking about when we're, you know, having people take accountability for their actions, even after the fact, but that they can come together, and then the community is also there to support them, right? So this idea of that reintegrative shaming, that person is there to support them and to work with them and be that good community support who's now welcomed you back to the community, because it's all transparent, it's all in the open. So that's another area that we're working on, as well as we are looking to do victim-led circles. So similarly, it has to be voluntary, but this is typically when the referral comes through victim services, or maybe, you know, if they're a community or someone to us saying that they want to have some sort of healing circle or restorative process with the person that has committed the harm or either to themselves or maybe to a family member. So in that case, we would have to, the victim would have to come forward, and we would have to ask the client if they want to participate. And that one's a little bit trickier. Numbers across Canada for these type of programs aren't as high, although there's a need for it, and there's certainly, we want to ensure that we're offering our victims as much as a say in this as we can. And part of that is typically the referral comes from someone doing wrong, right? So that's how we get that file. This would be coming from the other way. So it's much more victim focused, but at the end of the day, we have to make sure that that the offender is willing to participate. But what studies are showing is that when they do happen, and when people do voluntarily agree to come together in these more serious crimes, that this is really when restorative processes are the most beneficial when done right. And so we're going to be looking to facilitate those as well. Similar to the reintegration circles, they take longer. So they're not going to be something, where you meet your victim, you meet your offender, you bring them together, an hour and a half later, you have some agreement that they've all come out to, right, for a simple shoplifting charge, which is really beneficial as well. But it'll sometimes take lots of time, because there's going to be healing, there's going to be, counseling that's necessary. There's going to be other pieces that are going to go along with it. And in some circumstances, multiple circles or processes will have to occur. So that's kind of the rough outline for 2 years. We'll also be looking to do, sentencing circles, and we've also piloted, kind of some neat things already here in the Yukon, where we were allowed to do a very serious restorative process for a very serious crime, where the person was going to be sentenced, but we did it prior to sentencing, and then they were able to share what we did with the judge and say, and some of it had some recommendations into sentencing that they wanted on the probation order. And so there's those options as well, where we can get a little bit more creative. It's not a diversion in the way that, it won't be diverted from the court, and they won't, have a criminal record, or they won't have a sentence. So we just have to be clear what we're doing with them, but we can absolutely have interventions at all these different areas. Once again, if everyone's agreeable to it. So these are, oops, that didn't move. Types of interventions. So these are some of the basic ones you're going to see across Canada, with the added one that we're doing here of that restorative justice to inform sentencing. But typically what we see are the pre-charge referrals. So of course, those are the ones coming from the RCMP for youth or adults. We will get the post-charge referrals, and those are coming from the court. And then there's the post-sentencing one. So this is when we can get creative, and we can use restorative processes to inform sentencing. There's no, and we're very clear when we do this, that there's no extra motivation as far as, this can't be used. It's not your get out of jail free card. It's not something where, we can't guarantee it either, right? It's just the only thing that we're doing is we're presenting, and they've agreed to take it into consideration, right? And that's fair. And I think as long as is that another question? Is that what my beep is for? How do mental health and addiction issues affect restorative justice issues and the work of the IRJ unit? Yeah, so that's a great question. So if we have somebody that has a mental health issue or addiction issue, we would typically make that referral to the appropriate avenue, right? But there also might be circumstances when it's so great that we can't do a process at that point. So if someone has some pretty serious mental health issues or addictions, and they can't be, sober to sit down and do this, we don't want to put that person in front of a victim and victimize them further. So that would be something that, depending on the situation, maybe we can roll with it. I've had people that have had some fairly serious cognitive disabilities come through restorative process, and they've brought a worker with them who helps them, right? Who can work with that. And that might be the same for mental health, depending on what type of mental health it is. and similarly with addiction. But what we won't do is we won't put anyone else at risk, or even that person at risk, if they're not ready and they're not able to sit in a room. Then that may not be a file that we can take. But we certainly try and work with our other partners and make sure that people are getting the mental health help that they need, that they are getting, you know, any kind of addictions treatment, and we're putting those referrals in as well. Did that answer your question, Darcy?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so post-sentencing, RJ to inform sentencing, it's very cool. Sentencing circles are also fairly common. They're really big, I want to say in the 80s and the 90s. They kind of dropped off, and then there's been this resurgent. And I think, and this is just my observation and some of my reading, so take it, you know, as it is. But I think with that is, when they go wrong, they go really wrong. So I know I've talked to people who have been part of sentencing circles, and you know, the victims haven't been allowed to speak, or you know, it was something that, you know, had a mandatory minimum, and that, you know, sentencing that wasn't explained, and then so everyone said no jail time, and at the end the judge had to say, well, no, that there has to be jail time, right? So it's all, in my mind, it's all about expectations and making sure everyone understands their roles and understands what they're going to get out of this. But I do think that there was a drop in them because there were some that maybe weren't being done you know, as well as they could have been. If you don't have a trained facilitator who's doing that pre-work, which I think is where most of the information and the work comes before you even get in that circle. And so if you have a good mediator or facilitator, there really shouldn't be surprises when you all come together, because they have talked to everybody, uncovered everybody's you know, underlying interests, and then they should know what they're going to say. Of course, there's always going to be some surprises and pieces, but there shouldn't be a lot. So that's that piece for me there. But we're starting to see more of them happening again, and we're seeing them in different ways. So it's not, I think, gone are the old days of looking at sentencing circles as, you know, it's just going to be this process that's held in a community, and then they're going to, you know, decide on the sentence. You can do them for very serious crimes, and it's still almost that healing piece where those people get to talk about how they've been impacted. And at the end of the day, you still got, you know, you've got your crown, you've got your defense lawyer, and you've got your judge, right? And they're going to make their decisions based on, you know, what they have to, and the precedent and those pieces. But there's still an opportunity for that circle to happen. So I think it's, with restorative processes, it's, at one point when people first started doing it, it was fairly rigid. What can you and can't you do? Now we're looking at it, you know, in, if you will, in a more of a restorative way, where it's much more flexible. We're saying what's going to work for this file and what aligns itself with the current justice system, so that we can work together. And in my mind, and I think what we're doing here in the Yukon is, it's gone as this idea of one or the other, right? It's, sure, sometimes it'll go through a restorative process, sometimes it'll go through court, sometimes they'll benefit from both. And that's something neat that we can explore. So right now too, we are working closely with the Justice Wellness Center, particularly with the DVTO, where if they have someone going through their programming with DVTO court, we can do a restorative process alongside that program to then help if those, you know, if the two partners or the family wants to get back together. So there's still, so it's not a diversion, it's not instead of, it's just really to better support our clients going through that on both sides. One of the gaps that was identified with the DVTO court is that, you know, that the clients get this programming and they come out of it after their 12 weeks of programming, but the victim who maybe they're coming home to, they haven't been part of it. And they maybe even haven't had that initial discussion, and that victim has, you know, feelings of, oh, I shouldn't have called the police. I wish I hadn't. I wish, you know, like, because they haven't been able to have those conversations. And so we want to create that safe space for them to talk. Should it be safe? Just to be clear, we're very careful if we're, you know, bringing people together. We have all the right they've done their assessment. We're making sure that we're legally allowed to do so, that we're not inflicting further harm on the victims. But if all those pieces align and it's something that they want while they're undergoing that process, we can absolutely do a restorative process to align and support, to bring that family back together and have those conversations prior to them completing, in this case, DVTO. So we're working on that with DVTO, as well as if we have somebody that comes to us that's more of a serious offense, we can also send that person, if they meet the criteria, to their programming. So, I mean, that wouldn't be something that we're going to see a lot of, because as far as the criteria, it's assault is supposed to be one of those ones that, depending on the level of assault, but, we wouldn't necessarily take. However, in our agreement, we do have a caveat that says, in certain circumstances and with proper consultation, with Crown Defense, victim services, whoever might be impacted, if we agree that this is going to be beneficial, then we can do it. So we definitely have a gray area that we can work in, and that's sometimes where we can be most beneficial. And then there's the post-sentence intervention. So we have our reintegration work, which I was just talking about, our victim-led, and then we've got our healing circles as well. And healing circles can happen at any time. They don't even have to be attached to a crime per se. Similarly, if we get a community referral, that would come kind of before that pre-charge. So we might see a youth issue. A school might call us and say, can you do a restorative process? I've got these two kids. I'm worried it will escalate into something that could be criminal. Can we try and work with them? And so we can do those as well. Okay. So adult diversion referral process, this is strictly just for our pre-charge, post-charge. Essentially, there's an incident, the RCMP are called. If it's pre-charge, then it's going to go to your intake and assessment. If not, it goes to the Crown or the court, and it can come as post-charge. Once again, if they refer it to us, we do that intake and assessment. Everything's by consent, and then you'll see here, in the case of the client is First Nation descent, then we are working with the community justice coordinator. This is still a process that we're working out with the First Nation community as far as what files they want to take on. And of course, we still have to provide that training and get that program authorization. Then,
question just popped up in the chat window, if I can interrupt.
Yes.
So it's from Zachary Davis, and feel free to chime in, Zachary, if you wish. Question is, how do you structure a restorative justice program when the victim isn't necessarily a person? For example, in the context of regulatory offenses for hunting, fishing, forestry, etc. And I assume by extension, in the criminal context, drug offenses or impaired driving, things like that.
Yeah. So great question. So I'll answer that in two sections. So first of all, if there's not a clear victim, we can still work and create a restorative process that goes around with that. We have options such as, so for example, let's say it was a drug charge, and we have someone, we can get someone from mental health and wellness or substance use to talk about the impacts of that, and really have that educational component. If we think back to the earlier one, we were talking about partially restorative and those pieces, that would be in that partially restorative piece, and we can absolutely do that. So we're not yet doing territorial offenses. We're only doing federal offenses right now. However, this is something we're going to be moving into very quickly, because we've identified that same need, Zachary, that you're talking about, is restorative processes for hunting and fishing, where there's not necessarily a clear victim. I don't know yet how we're going to handle it. I have ideas how I would handle it, but I'll tell you what they're doing in other parts of Canada with those type of files is if someone, say, is fishing on a First Nation land and they're not supposed to be, what we might do is we might get someone from the community, or from, like a conservation officer, and someone from, the First Nation community, from leadership, to talk about the impacts and how that impacts the land. And we're looking at maybe at the land as the victim, right? And then they still have to take that same accountability and then make reparations depending on that situations. Some jurisdictions have kind of prescribed things that they do. So for example, they might say, you know, for every drug charge, it's 5 hours of community service, plus you take this program. Whereas other ones will hold a process every time and say, you know, for the example of the fishing, you know, you were fishing here, so you're going to meet with the people who's right, and take that lens of like, you're taking food away, you know, from these people who it's their right to fish there, or maybe you're depleting the waters and it's not the time. But there was a case I worked on a couple years back, and it ended up being challenged. So it's still in the courts, but it was a First Nations person who was fishing on reserve, but it wasn't their reserve. It was their boyfriend or their girlfriend's reserve. And so they were fishing there, but they had also, they had set down the big trap, whatever you call those things, the big nets, and had taken more fish. But that probably wouldn't have been the biggest issue. The bigger issue is that Chief and Council had said no one's to fish here right now because we've been told by like wildland and fisheries that we're depleting the waters and we need to, I can't remember how long they weren't allowed to fish to, but the whole community had agreed not to fish in those times. So for that, they held a restorative process. And then there was kind of this idea between, yeah, you're taken from the land, but you're also taken from the fish, right? And how are you going to make those reparations? That one is a bit trickier because then there was a whole challenge about First Nations having the right to fish, and so that was elevated. But typically that's what people would do, is they can get really creative about what the victim or who the victim is, or really if the community's been impacted by this type of crime. And the reason I really like and why we want to move maybe into some of these territorial offenses is because we also want to provide that educational component, right? So there's an idea, if you've done something wrong, maybe you're given a warning, or maybe you're given a ticket, but we know that often some of those tickets don't get paid, right? So now we have unpaid tickets, or they just get paid and then people move on, and there maybe hasn't been that educational piece or that giving back to the community. So that's where we would do a process and make sure that those other interests are being met. Does that answer the question?
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it's neat actually if you look across Canada to see what other people are doing. Even in Surrey, BC, they're doing for distracted driving tickets, they're doing restorative processes for those as well. So basically where they come in, they do programming, right? They talk about, you know, the risks and what could have happened, and much in the same way that Matt or Sad might talk about with drinking and driving, right? So they do some of those pieces, but then everyone has to you know, talk about what they did, and that's, you know, people might say, well, that's just a small ticket, but this idea that you have to go someplace and it's impacting your day and you have to give back somehow, and it's not just money, right? Because some of those tickets aren't that expensive. Then there's that learning piece. It's also, some jurisdictions do it with liquor tickets. So that's an interesting one as well. We're finding here that in the territory, for example, in Old Crow, there are a lot of liquor tickets, but majority of them are unpaid. So we need to try something else, right? So maybe a restorative option might work in some of those cases. And this is the youth diversion one. So this is very similar. The one difference is that we have the White Horse Youth Justice Panel, and then we also have the Section 6 pre-charges, if you want to call them that, the Section 6 charges versus the Section 10 pre-charges. So a little bit different there versus the other ones. You know, with the adults, it's a pre-charge or post-charge, but the idea is that you complete it, your charges will be withdrawn, or you won't be charged in the case of the RCMP pre-charging. But with the youth, with the Section 6, that basically is a warning or caution letter, but they could come through a program, do a restorative process. The only difference there is that should they not complete, the RCMP don't have the authority to go back and lay an official charge. If they want to do that, then they'd be going by Section 10. So the Section 6 pre-charges would be fairly low level or very low level. and the RCMP or officer would have to believe that that person's going to complete for it to go that way. But typically everything else, how the file comes to us, what happens, in the court process, of course, if it's diverted fully to us and we have an agreement we send back, then we would request that all charges be withdrawn. But then in the case of some of those more creative ones that I was talking about earlier, we don't have those teeth, first of all, to say like you do this or, right? It's more like you're doing this, but it's voluntary and it could be used to inform sentencing. It could be used as part of your reintegration plan, right? So there's just differences in those. But for how we get files for pre-charge, post-charge, this is essentially what we do. And then, like I said, once all the pre and post-charge files will come through the IRJ unit. And then we work with the First Nation communities to make sure that they're getting their file. And the reason we're doing that, it's not to take control. We want them to have their own programs and processes. The idea behind that is that if there's turnover in the community, or if there's a conflict of interest, or maybe someone's not trained, we don't want the client who has the right to be considered right for a diversion to suffer because of that. So what we do here is, if it comes here and we find out, okay, that person is Champagne-Ajac, then we call, and it happened, out in Haines Junction, then we'll call the justice worker and we'll say, we have a file. Are you able to take this on? So that looks into, have you been trained? First of all, are you an approved program? And then, do you have someone in that position who can facilitate? Is there a conflict of interest? And if there is, then that's fine. We come out and facilitate. Or in some of the communities where there is no justice worker, we'll just drive out and we'll do that. And we'll sometimes work with the Indigenous court worker, and they'll help set stuff up for us as far as like find us a room and those pieces, but otherwise we'll come out and do the file. What we also do is we provide mentorship and training to the First Nation community justice workers, and then in the future, any other service providers that are going to be wanting to take on these type of files. We'll do the training, and part of our mentorship program is that so that people aren't left alone to do this, because in the communities, that's a real risk, is people might come for a training, they fly to Old Crow, and no one talks to them again, and suddenly they're facilitating all these files. It can be very difficult and intimidating. So we want to work with them. So we'll go out, of course, with invitation, but we would go to Old Crow and we work with them. We'll facilitate a few side by side, then we'll co-facilitate, then we'll kind of just be in the room. And then, of course, we always offer to come up and support. So it's a bit of that, those pieces that we're still working out as this unit's fairly new. So the pieces we're looking at right now with our First Nation partners is, first of all, do you want to do this type of work? And if you do, what type of files do you want to take on? Some of the First Nation communities may only want to take on youth files, and that's fine. So then we would cover the rest. So then we're trying to figure out those pieces. If you guys want to do youth, then we'll do all the adults for you. Does that work? Right. So it's having those conversations, also figuring out, will they be doing, will the First Nation communities be doing just their own citizens or the adjacent town, right? So will Champagne-Ajac be doing Champagne-Ajac and Haines Junction, or just one? Because if it's just one, that's fine. We will support, the other communities, or, will Ross River be doing Faro, or, will we come up and do Faro? So we're trying to figure out those pieces. We hope to have some agreements out. I don't want to jinx it by saying too early, but we hope to have some of those pieces and agreements figured out, midsummer, and then we'll be able to move on this. But that is the reason why we want the files to come through here. It's just to make sure that, we can continue that service. And then also we take on the responsibility of, making sure that that information gets back to court in time, right? So that we're not telling the court, the Crown and defense the day before. We want to give them 2 weeks. Like, here's where we're at. So what we've written to the agreement was, to update 2 weeks before the court date. But what we've started to do in practice, which I think works better for all parties, is we're actually updating them as we go. And that's partially because we're a new program, and that makes sense. But so once, say, we have a process and we have an agreement, then we would send that to both, defense and Crown if it's in the court, or if it's with RCMP, we'd send them and say, this is what they've agreed to. That also allows, everyone to know how much longer we may need. So for example, we might run a restorative process and say there's a huge restitution amount to be paid. And so we're going to need an 8-month adjournment. So that's a conversation then we would have. We'd be like, hey, this is what came out of the agreement. They want to make these payments. We have to be realistic about how they can do that. They can't pay the lump sum. So we've scheduled, this X amount of money over 8 months. And we have our full schedules of what they pay each time. Can we have an adjournment for that date? So we want to update, you guys as quickly as we can, so that we have an idea of how long we need this adjournment for them to complete or not complete the file. And of course, should they not complete, it goes back to Crown, who will then, decide, maybe it's partially complete. It'll be within their discretion. Similarly, it would go back to the RCMP if they don't complete, and then they would proceed from there as well with their discretion to lay an official charge. So for the ones in court, we've given ourselves typically 3 months for your typical file, and that would be from start to then close, complete, and finish everything they have to do. We might request extensions, like I said, if what comes out of their agreement is just more time consuming than originally thought, then we'd do that. Okay, and I am, Leo, do I have till 1:30? Is that right?
That's right. And
Oh, sorry.
we did promise a bit of a Q&A. So
Yeah. Okay, that's okay. I think we're almost done here. This is basically what we've agreed to. All offenses can really be considered. Like I said, under the criminal code, there's certain offenses that are excluded, and we've written that into our agreement for federal offenses. The only difference is that, like I said, we have that caveat. So, we might it might say that we don't take sexual assaults, when we might take a sexual assault, then we have. Because if the circumstance of that offense makes sense and everyone agrees to it, and we've had proper consultation, and we're not doing further harm to anyone, then we absolutely will do it. So it's really, we've tried to be as flexible as the law will allow us, and then some, to have that gray area for if something is suitable, even if it doesn't outwardly look like it meets the criteria. And of course, these are some of the options, which I think I've talked about, so I'll skip those. Our legislative authority, you guys know that, Section 717 of the Criminal Code, Section 10 of the Youth Criminal Justice Act. And then basically our eligibility is, the offender must accept responsibility. Prosecution of the offense is not barred by law, and there must be, in the opinion of the Crown, sufficient evidence to proceed with the prosecution of the offense. And then victim involvement. So what is the role of victim? Well, we absolutely want the victim to attend, but they have options. And so they can come in person. We can do victim impact statements, and we can read those out loud. We can also do a surrogate victim. So very soon we're going to be training some volunteers to act as surrogate victims. And this is not to pretend that they are the victim. This is to be there in the room should there be no clear victim that we can call on, or if the victim really doesn't want to participate, or maybe they've moved far away and they're not interested, and they're like, no, I don't care what happens. That's fine. Or they can care what happens, and we can update them later. So we really try and work with the victim to provide them as many options as we can to ensure that so that they have a voice in some way and they can participate how they want to. That's really important for us. There's barriers around that, of course, because often when victims are asked initially if they want to participate, they'll say no, and that's typically usually because the offense has just happened, or if you think back to when I was talking about the iceberg or the satisfaction triangle, is that they're not in the place yet where we've gone to their underlying interest. They're stuck in their position, so they're saying we want them to pay, we want jail. So we're figuring out those pieces, and that's been a dialogue across Canada, is how can we better provide victims with the information of how this benefits them when we can't necessarily contact a victim. For example, the RCMP has to request that or get consent from them to give us their phone number. So that's a tricky piece that we're trying to figure out there. And then, yeah, restorative justice for justice transformation. We're really excited, like I said, about the kind of the political arena that we have now, where we can be more innovative with using restorative justice as interventions in all areas of the criminal justice system and completely outside of it as well. As I said, this works towards First Nation reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Missing Murder, Indigenous Women and Girls Two-Spirited, final report. I put in here no longer the alternative because it's really exciting. I was on the FPT call and we were talking with all the deputy ministers across Canada, and there's a National Restorative Collaborative Learning Conference going on in Halifax, where deputy ministers from each province and territory have been invited, along with 10 other folks from each province and territory, to really collaborate on restorative justice for justice transformation. And one of the key themes that was discussed is, like, it's not the alternative. We're going to be the mainstream, right? This is, there's room for both. There's room for all types of justice, right? So the current justice system still needs to operate, and it's not about taking over that. It's about becoming as mainstream as that, and really working together and figuring out how we can align to have restorative processes. Yeah, so sorry I kind of sped up at the end, but we have a whole 5 minutes for hopefully some questions.
Thanks, Christina. And again, the presentation will be available on the website after, if you wanted to go back to some of those the later slides there. But we do have a question from Mara Pollock, and the question is, what is your experience working with male victims of violence?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. So as far as male victims, I've worked with a few myself, and oops, did that screen go away? Okay, anyways, I've worked with a few myself, and often the idea of even being called a victim could be a barrier for them. So we get a lot of men who aren't necessarily even willing to come forth, but when they do, it's quite difficult to get them in the circle. And I've done this also for historic sexual abuse, where we've worked with communities, Crown, RCMP, to come together to say, let's look at some of these historic pieces outside of the justice system, but with full cooperation of everyone. And it's extremely difficult for the males of, the violence or sexual abuse to be part of that. But we have done it when we've done some of those more serious ones. Well, any of the serious ones, we're always making sure that we have appropriate counseling in place if they want elder supports along with our processes, but also making sure that they have those structures in place afterwards.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
Can I just have one follow-up question, if you will indulge me?
Yes.
Do you find that there are fewer male victims of violence than that have passed through the system, your restorative justice program, or that access it than female?
Yeah, so in my experience, I would say yes. And I know, working with the DVTO court, or the community wellness court, I think they found the same things. But interestingly enough, I was just talking with victim services, and we were talking about the idea of, if people wanted to deal with something what would that look like? And if it was, for example, a man or a woman, but because they've had some men and women that have come through that don't want it to be dealt with, in the formal justice system. And so they're asking, is there a way that we can do something like this outside, right? So those are some of the pieces we're trying to look at right now, but very carefully, because at the same time, there's a risk, right? We don't want to cause further harm or re-victimize anyone through some of our actions. So we're exploring, but we're exploring carefully.
Perfect. Thank you.
Good questions, though.
A question from Christina Zahar. How does one sign up to volunteer to be a surrogate victim?
Oh, well, that's great. It looks like I have someone already. We haven't started it yet, but what we'll probably do is we'll send out an email to our partners. We should have our website up and running, let's say fingers crossed, fairly soon. And then so that way I'll post something as well. But Christina, if you're interested, I would be glad to take your name and number after this, and I can contact you. Or if you know someone who's interested, for sure. But what I can do is once we have that training ready to go, I can connect with Leo, and you could send something out on my behalf, I suppose, if you're agreeable.
Certainly.
Excellent. Thank you.
I don't see any more coming in. I did have a question for you, Christina. What,
Yes.
I'm thinking specifically of the adult diversion program, the new adult diversion program. What do you hope to see from that program as in the outcomes? Like what would indicate success for you? And is there a plan to track and measure those outcomes?
Yeah. So we are creating a full evaluation that's going to be looking at different forms of success and then tracking the numbers that come through. So it's interesting. So we borrowed some of those evaluation and metrics across Canada to see what we're looking for. And it's not necessarily the idea. I mean, I think ideally it's like they go through the program and then they never reoffend and life is good. That can be difficult to track, but we definitely will even see a success if somebody, comes through the process and completes that. That would be our number one success. But we're also looking at other pieces as far as victim satisfaction out of that outcome, right? So there's kind of the both sides of have we lowered recidivisms? Have we created court efficiencies? What's one of them, so that the courts can deal with the more serious issues. And then our victim satisfaction, lower recidivism rates, lower incarceration rates of particularly First Nation individuals, but really all individuals for our lesser crimes. So some of those pieces that we're still working on our final evaluation and our privacy impact assessment with our policy folks, but it will look something like that. And satisfaction surveys as well will be a part of it following the process. But I don't know if I answered your first part, but as far as outcome, what we want is we want adults who are eligible to go through a restorative process and meet the criteria to have that opportunity to really make reparations and repair the harm. So that would kind of be the holistic answer versus the numbers answer. We just have to figure out how to properly track that.
All right, we are a little bit over time and I don't see any more live questions. So I think we'll call it there. If people have questions about your programs generally, or perhaps if they're working with a client and want to find out or want to explore the possibility of diversion, who should they contact?
Yeah, so right now they can contact me. Once we have our website up and running, it'll actually be as simple as putting it online, much in the same way that if you do a scan complaint, you can do that. The Safer Communities and Neighborhoods, it's all privacy protected. You can put that information in. In the meantime, we're saying there's no wrong way to get more information or send a referral, but you can give me a call or send me an email. We also have our generic restorative justice email, which I can send to you, Leo, as well, to give afterwards, where you can send a referral. But as we're figuring out some of the logistics and making sure we know what we need to open a file and what you guys need from your end, we're just saying, yeah, give us a call, send us an email, and we'll take the files from there.
Sounds good. All right, thank you, Christina. It sounds like exciting things ahead in the upcoming years. I look forward to hearing more about the program and how it's working out. So thank you all for your attention today and for participating. And Christina, thanks again. And we'll end it there. Bye for now.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.